All right, so today we've got two shorter Simanim. Personally, I think some very fun ones, especially Sadi Gimel. One of the most like kind of bonkers shitas that you see in sort of the entirety of kashrut, in my opinion. So I think we're going to spend slightly more time on Sadi Gimel. I think we will be doing it, Joel, don't worry. And I think we're going to just start with the Torah Nosei Kelim, because I gave you guys the Gemara to reference, but we'll see that within the Nosei Kelim here. So I think it's worth just plunging in. Right, so our first one, Sadi Gimel, is on this idea of meat and dairy pots and what happens both when there's potentially an oopsie with the meat and dairy pots or lechatchila, interesting ways of switching the gender of your pot. So Yavni, can you start off with Aleph in the Torah?
Sure. דירה שבישל בה בשר לא יבשל בה חלב. So if you have a pot that you have cooked meat in it, you shouldn't cook dairy in it. ואם בישל בה... what?
Yeah, nice and straightforward. Anyway, continue.
ואם בישל בה בתוך מעת לעת אסור. And if you do so within a day of the cooking of the meat, then it is forbidden, presumably the food.
And the Beit Yosef kind of takes the Torah to task on this as to why he just says asur stam. So the Beit Yosef is like, he's not necessarily always going to be usur. It's that it's usur if there's the tam, right? Or if you go like the Ramah that we don't hold by kfela, it's usur if there isn't shishim, right? But that it is usur unless you have a form of bitul. Okay, keep going.
אבל אם שהה מעת לעת, קודם שבישל בה, הווה לנותן טעם לפגם ומותר. But if it's been more than a day since you cooked the meat, then it becomes giving flavor for damage, and it's permitted.
Great. Okay, so all of that's pretty straightforward, right? And this also, we'll see coverage of various concepts that we've already seen come up in various places, right? So we've covered noten tam lifgam. We have that in the back of our minds. Now we're going to have an interesting sack. Joel?
Before we get into the Bali tour, maybe I wanted people's opinions. And the Beit Yosef felt like he was protesting too much here to me. Like, it's like, of course, number one, we have like he brings this up. We have a principle in general that you can't have the contents of a pot be 60-1 against the pot necessarily. It's very difficult.
Although he's about to, in the next section, also have to try and explain how that could happen. Exactly.
If you have like very thin pot, very wide, base and all that. But it's just like, of course, the Torah thinks if you could get 60 to how could it? Doesn't that seem like Muvan Me'elav? He's just like talking about in general, it's asur, right? He doesn't have to say every single time something's asur. I don't know. I just wanted a sense of why does the Beit Yosef even take that up at that point?
My guess is that he's particularly bothered by it because of what follows, right? Mm-hmm. Because we are about to follow with a case where we say when there is shishim, right? Like as in like we are about to do that, right? So I think maybe if we weren't about to immediately follow it up with a case where we do propose the idea of there being shishim against the pot, then you'd be like, yes, fine, min hastam, we generally assume that it would be usur. Right? Or that, of course, we can take it for granted that if there were shishim, but like the fact that the Torah just says usur with no qualification, and then we get people talking about cases where there is shishim, I think is part of what makes it a little weird. Okay.
But also remember the Beit Yosef holds that you can have a goy taste it. You don't even need shishim necessarily. It could be 40, and it could be mutter.
Right, especially since this is a case where there isn't guf ha'isur, right? That there's actually, and there's some people who, right, like are holding, even if they generally don't hold by timat kfela, right? There's stuff around like, yes, even people who generally would say that you need shishim and blank, they're like, yeah, if there's no guf ha'isur, which definitionally when we're dealing with clean pot, there isn't, then if there's no tam, the normative opinion the Ramban articulates is that as long as there's no tam, it's fine. Okay, so now let's get into the Bala Itor. Yavni, can you keep reading?
כתב בעל העיטור, אם בישל חלב בקדרה של בשר, והיא בת יומא, ויש בה 60, איכא מאן דאמר מבשל בה ממין שבישל בה עכשיו, כיוון שהתבשיל מותר, טעם הראשון בטל, וקדרה נמי מותרת. So now what do you do with the pot? So if, same case, you had a pot that you cooked in it meat, and then you cooked in it dairy, and it was within a day, but there was 60 in the dairy that you put in the pot against the, against what? Against, the meat, whatever that means.
Against whatever we're measuring from the pot.
What?
Yeah, against whatever we're measuring from the pot.
Whatever they're measuring for either
we-
the pot itself or or what it absorbed. There are those who say that that after that you should cook in it what you have just cooked in it, i.e. the dairy. Because we have decided that this dairy dish is permitted, the original flavor of the meat is nullified, and therefore the pot itself is permitted to be used for the dairy.
Right.
The
So
Ikamanda-
we'll see some thoughts about this and also about the Bali Tor's final sheet there, right? But the idea theoretically being that we're dealing with all of the flavor has been expelled. It's been batel. And so now the only thing that'll be in it is whatever you just cooked now. Okay. The Ikamanda.
This is like Hagalah b'ochel.
Correct. So we'll get into that.
ואיכמן דאמר, כיוון דקיימא לן כלי חרס אינו יוצא מידי דופיו לעולם, טעם הראשון אינו יוצא לעולם, ואינו יכול לבשל בה ממין שבישל בה עכשיו. וממין הראשון אינו יכול לבשל בה שהרי האחרון אינו בטל. On the other hand, there are those who say that because we're talking about a ceramic vessel, which we have this principle that the stuff that's in it, that's absorbed into it, never leaves fully, then the original flavor of the meat is never going to come out, and therefore you can't cook in it the new flavor. You can't cook in it dairy, and you also can't cook in it the original flavor of meat because the later flavor also is never also wasn't batel. Or it just wasn't batel, because you had a whole pot of milk. Ve'en la takana ela shvira, and therefore there's nothing to do with it except break it. Ve'katav hu sheyachol levashel ba me'eze min sheyirtzeh, but the Bali tool himself concludes apparently that you can use it for either that you want, whatever you want, either meat or dairy.
Right. He thinks you've made it parv now, right? You had a meat pot, you cooked enough milk in it that it's shishim times that meat, and now you have a parv pot. The Torah does not like this. But ani tamia.
Yeah, try to go on. ואני תמה, היאך מותר לבשל בחלב. וכי עדיף מעגלה? How is it possible that we can permit cooking dairy in it? Is cooking dairy in it better than cooking better than doing hagalah with water, which we say we can't do with cheres, or you can't do me'et le'et. Da'afilu hagalah lo mahani lekli cheres shepolet tamid me'et le'et, right? And because what I just said.
I need can you just explain it again or better? What's really bothering him, I guess, is my problem.
What's bothering him is that the Bali tool would say that in this situation where you have a meat pot that you've cooked in it dairy, that you can now cook in it dairy.
Right.
As if I had a meat
But he's
pot,
a halachic man, the Bali Torah. Sounds straight. So what's bothering his commentator?
but the tool is bothered by this permissiveness, because if you took that same pot that was a ceramic pot that had been a meat pot, and you wouldn't say now you can do hagalah, you can put it in boiling water and then it can be used for dairy. You wouldn't say that. So why do you say that after you've used it for dairy? Wait, after you've cooked milk in it.
Right. Ultimately, if our principle is that hagalah of any sort doesn't work on a kli cheres,
Right.
why is dafka cooking milk in it working in a way that cooking boiling water in it wouldn't? right? So we will now have both various suggestions as to how to explain this somewhat wild shita of the Bali Itor, and also explaining the other interesting thing about the Torah, which the Nosei Kelim will pick up on, is why he was only shocked at the Baal HaItor saying about the chalav, right? That's the first shita is saying you can do chalav in it now. The Baal HaItor is saying you can cook either of them. They're like, why is the chalav a crazier thing than the fact that you can cook basar in it after you just cooked a little chalav? So we'll have some explanations. So we're going to start with the Beit Yosef, right? So Beit Yosef, the one with the Dibor Matzil Katav Baal HaItor. So in the Shir Dvorah edition that I have, the actual Beit Yosef himself begins on the top of Reish Kaf. So Jess, would you be able to take it away with that? Kashed Adifa Mina.
I'm just finding. Okay, here we go. Kashed Adifa Minahu לאקשוי לבעל האיתור, שמציע לבשל בה מאיזה מין שירצה. איך מציע לבשל בה בשר אחר שבשל בה חלב, בלי הפסק, שום תבשיל ביניהם. ונראה למה זה לרוטה נקט שהוא תמה איך מותר לבשל חלב, אף על פי שכבר בשל בה חלב, ונטמעת טעם בשר הבלועה בה, וכל שכן שיש לטמוע, איך מציע לבשל בה בשר אחר שבשל בה חלב, בלי הפסק שום תבשיל ביניהם.
Okay.
The summary is just like, how on earth can you possibly say this?
Specifically, what's the Beit Yosef's question on the Torah?
This is a question on the top is why is he wondering about permitting milk after you've already cooked, like these questions aren't equivalent. Like there's a difference between going back to meat and cooking some milk in it. Is that
right? Not only that there's a difference, right? But like, why does the Torah only challenge him about the fact that the Baal Torah allows him to cook chalav, right? It seems like the fact that he allows him to cook basar, even though he just cooked chalav in it, should be even crazier, right? And so, his answer is like, oh, this is like l'ravutta. He's like, I'm shocked that he even allows you to cook chalav in it after this, even though a lot of the basar has been niflat. Kal v'chomer, I'm shocked that he allows you to cook basar in it. Okay, and now we're gonna have an interesting explanation of the Bali Torah's thing. Mahari ibn Habib.
I'm even shocked, right? Not I'm shocked that he even, right? I'm even shocked that he
Exactly. I am even shocked he allowed you to cook chalav in it. I would be like even more shocked by the fact that he allows you to cook basar.
It's a weird use of the term ravuta for the Beit Yosef here. Ravuta usually means the more extreme.
It's not the opposite of ravuta, but he's kind of just being like, he's using that to teach you that he like is even, that he is even shocked that you would be allowed to cook chalav, and that like obviously when I say the chalav, he would know that I'm shocked that you're allowed to cook basar, which obviously is not obvious from the fact that various Nosei Kelim pick up on this and ask about it, but as it were. So Jess, can you continue with the Mahari?
והמהרי ניסן חפיף כתב שנראה לי שדעת בעל האיתו, אם בשל חלב בקטריה שבשל בבשר, חשיב בישול החלב בה, כהגלה, אם נזהה לשפוט אותו חלב מהקטריה, קודם שתנוח הרתיחה, דמה לי מים הבלועים מאיסו מלי חלב איסו. הלבדי כבר הלך לו, כל טעם החלב, בין מה שקבל מטעם הבשר, בין טעם החלב עצמו, דאיידי דטרית לפלוט לא בלה.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Mahari Nissan says that if you cooked milk in the meaty pot, that kind of cooking of the milk is somehow seen as Haggalah on.
I did that.
Sorry, what did you say? No connection.
Provided that.
Yeah. Provided that you're careful to like pour out all the milk from the thing before it gets to the boil.
Or before it stops boiling.
Yeah. Yeah, because just like how water would have removed the issa, so too milk can remove it.
Right. That like if you can kosher for things that are kosherable vis-a-vis Haggalah, if the idea is that if thing is expelled into the water and goes out, well then so too it should be expelled into the milk. Right. The milk can still draw out the flavor of the pot. And Ivy detari float lo bala. What does that phrase mean?
That we're dealing with a case where it's going to be expelled and not reabsorbed.
Right, that while the pot is busy expelling its flavor, it's not going to be absorbing the halal flavor, right? So the Mari Ibn Chaviv is basing this off of the like shekadam v'silko kind of principle, and this idea to tarid biflot, lo bala, which we'll see the Bach challenge very smartly. But he's suggesting, right, that if you pour out the milk while it's still boiling, the milk would have absorbed the basar flavor, but the pot would not have had the chance to absorb any chalav flavor. So that's his suggestion of how the Baal HaYitor thinks you've made this part of, right? All the meat has been expelled into the milk. None of the milk has been absorbed into the pot. Now you just have empty pot walls. Okay, and so now according to Mahari Ibn Chaviv's explanation, we see a different explanation of the Torah's kasha. Rabbeinu Yaakov Tama Alav.
Rabbeinu Yaakov Tama Alav, משום דאפילו אם תרצה לומר שלא נשאר בקדרה טעם חלב, לפי שנשפך בעודרותיה, אבל טעם הבשר שקבלה תחילה לא יצא כלום, וההחלטי לבשל בחלב. עד כאן. Yeah, so like fine, you've maybe got rid of the milk, but like there's still going to be some meat flavor. You don't know that you've expelled all the meat flavor.
Right. That he's like, this is according to this explanation, the reason the Torah specifically challenges the milk is that fine, actually maybe I accept the principle that the pot wouldn't have had the chance to absorb milk, but because it's the kli cheres, and we say kli cheres can't be kosher with Haggalah, then there should still be meaty flavor. Right? Which is a smart explanation of the Torah's challenge, but again, we'll see that there's some potential issues with it. And then the rest of this video is just him explaining the issue we raised earlier, which is how do we have a scenario where there is shishim opposite the pot? There's three main suggestions. One of them is that we go like the Ravid, that you only measure b'mai denafak mine, right? Which again, not so clear how the Ravid envisions you measuring that, but it's something less than the pot. The second suggestion is that it's a pot where we know the amount of meat it has absorbed. Either it's new and we know the amount of meat total that's ever been cooked in it, or I think this comes up one of the other nosei kelim, even if it's old, but you know the amount of meat that has been cooked in the last day, that's the relevant factor, right? So maybe you just measure against that. Or third, as Joel mentioned earlier, maybe it's just a pot that's really wide, has really thin walls, and somehow you do have shishim in the liquid opposite the pot. Yavni, it looks like you had a hand. No. Okay. Well, Rav Joel, since you were excited about it, I'm gonna
Yeah.
The Bach.
All right.
So we're going to look at the Bach bet, also in the Tav Bala Itor. Take it away.
All right. Katav bali tur v'chule v'ani tmiya heach mutar levashel b'chalav v'chule. So that's the tour. V'yeshli tmoa is going to be similar to the Beit Yosef. Amai lo kasha le'nami heach mutar levashel b'basar achar shebishel b'chalav. Right. So what about that? Why didn't he ask why can you cook meat in it after you cook milk in it? De'alo l'tzfar rishona matir levashel b'chalav ve'oser levashel b'basar. Right, and because in the first explanation given by him, he says you can't cook basar, you can only cook chalav in it.
Which Beit Yosef are you reading?
I said it's the Bach. The Bach.
Oh, the Bach.
Yeah, sorry. So
How does it start?
It's the Bach bet. It's the Ktav Bala Itor.
Okay.
But right in the first explanation he gave, he said that you can cook milk in it, but you can't cook meat in it. So right. So it sounds like according to if you put the three shitot of the Bali Tur together, it sounds like there's more leaning towards you can't cook basar in it, but you can cook then you can't cook chalav in it. Right? That seems to be very weird. But two ikalamedak, de'alo b'sfar hashniya, osil v'shelo chalav, midekam elain kli cheres eno yotze midei dofio leolam. V'afal pichen lo chash Bali Tur la'achtama. Right, it's like really weird in the mitziata of this whole thing. He throws kli cheres in here, and he says that the reason that some people say you can't do anything with it is because it's kli cheres and it never gets kasher essentially, right? And those but then he doesn't seem to be concerned with that in the Reisha and the Seifa, which is very odd. Right? Which is a question we already felt from the Beit Yosef, also from the Torah. Really, that's the Torah's question. Is like it's kli cheres. What's going on? Imken ma rabbeinu lehosif tema. Right. So what's the Torah coming to add by saying is this any better than Haggalah? Right. That's like the least of our problems here.
Internal contradiction. Right.
Yeah.
That the point like you should have pointed out that the Bala Itor has already mentioned the opinion that this shouldn't work. Right. Like why did he not care about that second svara? So now he's about to summarize the Mahari ibn Chaviv that just saw. So down to where it says V'tema dehalo b'tchilat siman saribet.
Yeah. Here we go. I think I see it. Yeah. V'tema halo b'tchilat siman saribet. Muvar de'afilo kodem shetanuach hareticha. All right. I'm going to go through this slowly because it confuses me every time. So he explained earlier in the previous siman, the Torah explained that before the boiling stops, it doesn't re-emit anything that it just absorbs, right? Right. We saw that this is in the Tosfot. We saw this when they said, well, if you put like blue, vegetables in water, it still turns blue. I don't remember what they said. They didn't say blue, but I put that in there. So the explanation we got was that it doesn't kind of absorb and then re-emit, but what it does do is it exudes what it originally had in it. A feeling to Selamar Demashabala Tam Basar Ino Polet. So even if you say, right, that the basar flavor in the milk doesn't get re-emitted from the milk before the retichat, before the boiling stops, right? But for sure, the kedera has absorbed the chalav flavor when it's boiling, and that seems to be a problem. Ve'ana matzas varzo daktera detruda liflot tam basar betichat hachalav lo tieh bolat chalav. Right? Where do we find that? While it's busy, you have a pot that's busy, exuding its meat flavor. It doesn't absorb any of the meat milk flavor. Dafilu bechatichat kadvu tosfot del arminan id detarid liflot lo bala ela gabe dam. Right? Velo b'shar isurim. Even the Tosfot said that only works in terms of absorbing blood. Right, which we said is very slippery, but not with other isurim. All right. Ve'od dehachsfar dekodem shetanuach harticha mivla bala miflat lo palit lo shayach el b'chaticha aval lo b'davar lach kegon chalav deleka blia el tarovat kedeprishit besof siman saribet. Right, and also that whole thing was just about solid pieces. Right, that wasn't about a case of liquids. Remember, that was the case where you dropped a piece of basar in boiling milk, not a case of the boiling milk in the pan or in the pot, right?
Right. So he's saying the way that like expelling things happens with solids is different than liquids that are all just kind of like sloshing around all the time. right? Which
Mhm.
also like makes sense. The idea, again, like the idea that what we're thinking of this blia and the plita looks different when it's like a solid thing being cooked or whatever versus like sloshy liquids. Okay. For
keep
time, I
going.
don't think we can read the entirety of the rest of the Bach. The other big thing that he points out, and we'll see various people trying to reckon to explain how the Baal HaYitor could possibly think that this sort of Hagala works on a Fli Cheres. And
Mhm.
one of the suggestions that the Bach makes is that maybe the Baal HaYitor thinks that the Kli Cheres Chumras only apply to Isser, right? That it only applies to Isser, but that when it's only absorbed heter, as in this case, we don't apply the chumrah of like eno yotzeh midafio leolam. And finally, can you read in the
Yeah.
very end of the Bach, three
this the
lines
bit-
at the bottom in the Shirat Devorah where it says Vidat Rabbeinu he?
Yeah, I gotta find it. Let's see, I may have a different version than you do of Shirat Devorah. But this is when he suggests the b'diavad idea for klicheres, or is that
And this is even after that. This is the
after
very
that?
Vidat Rabbeinu he de kevan daktera.
Yeah, and okay, got it. Oh, it is 3 lines up. Vidat Rabbeinu hi tekivan dekadera hayta miuchedet levasar temahu leatir levashel ba'achshav chalav. Right. Right. It's very weird that this thing has already been a single. It's put in your meat part of your kitchen, right? This is your meat pot, right? How can you all of a sudden switch it to a milchik pot? Aval levashel ba'basar leachar me'et le'et shebishel ba'chalav. But it's not so crazy that if you wait 24 hours, you could cook meat in it again. Right? Right. So since you've waited 24 hours, right? It now reverts to its original state, which was that it was designated as a meat pot. Because you made a mistake. It was one time, but this is a meat pot leolam at the end of the day. And this also, I mean, I want to say it also connects to this like kind of amazing thing he has about this suggestion that maybe klicheres, because it has no fix, always becomes a b'diavad case after you wait.
Right. This is something we see in the Bach, and the Taz also picks up on this idea of like maybe, which again, it sort of like cancels out the whole actual force of the din, right? Being like, well, since en lo takana ela shvira, if we really say that, then maybe it's actually fundamentally b'diavad. You can cook something in it, which is a bit of a twisty logic that some of the other Nesikelim do not.
But we can let's put into the language of what where the rabbis goes there when they said atu ben yomo, atu eno ben yomo. In other words, they said we are going to equate a eno ben yomo to a ben yomo. So maybe, yeah, go ahead.
You're going to come and cook in it. You're going to say I have a meat pot. And because I know if I wait 24 hours, it's not a big deal, or I did it and it wasn't a big deal. Now I'm going to do it within the same day. I'm going to cook meat, and then right afterward, I'm going to cook milk in it. And that's what they're
Right.
really.
Why is this? And why is that gezerah maybe not applicable here? That's what I want to say. In other words, maybe that gezerah is not applicable here because we're only letting you do this once.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, it could be that this rule could theoretically apply even with a metal pot. In other words, we just don't want you. What's the point of the gezerah of atu ben yomo?
Right. We don't want you to be just treating it lightly and always constantly switching back and forth. But it's possible. Baal HaYitor is, of course, dealing, unlike what we're about to see in the Rashba, he is dealing with the b'diavad case. He's not saying, yes, take your bat yoma, meat pot and cook some milk in it. He's saying, if you did this, now this is what you can cook in it afterwards. Right. So
if you come to the rabbi and the rabbi tells you wait 24 hours and now you can use it again. So that's not going to lead people to like switching back and forth all the time. But by a metal pot, since we have a takana, so tell them to do the takana, tell them to do Hagala. I'm saying it makes sort of sense that they weren't goes there in such a case.
For Joel, and then we're gonna.
No, I would say that there's actually a chumrah, I think, that comes out of this though too, right? Which is this idea that maybe you shouldn't, even though there's takana, you shouldn't lechatchila start switching your pots around all the time, right? Like you can't be like, oh, I cooked meat in it today, I'm gonna wait 24 hours kosher, and then I'm gonna start using it for milk, and then
we do end up seeing develop, right? We end up seeing this incredibly strong minhag develop of like, you ideally should not be switching around. And we see also it does develop earlier in Ashkenaz. I had a teacher suggest that the reason that the separate pots and things develops earlier in Ashkenaz is because the Ashkenazi community had, from like an earlier time, had more servants, right? So they had more servants like in their homes, right? And so it makes more sense that if you have servants who are going to be in your kitchens, that you want to be particularly makpid about what has meat in it and what has dairy in it, not just trust that the thing will be koshered each time. But okay, we're gonna pick up with Rabbeinu Peretz. So in the Torah, Sarah, can you pick up with
And I
Peretz?
take issue. I take issue with your teacher because the Gezerah is from the times of the Talmud. The Talmud is saying have separate pots. The first thing you read today. You shouldn't cook in it. Right? Kederish bisha ba basar lo yivashel ba halab.
That's without
That's
kosher.
not saying. That's not saying within 24 hours.
Rav Nachum, the pshat is that you should do that without koshering it. That it's true that you can't kosher.
Or that we're talking about a kli cheres.
Right, either kli cheres or with a kli matechet, that without koshering it, even after me'etz la'etz, you can't lechatchila cook the other thing in it, even though it'll be mutar because of tam mifgam. But there is nothing here being said about not being allowed to, with a kli matechet, say to kosher it and then use it for the other thing.
And you're saying that was nahug in Artsot Mizrach, that in the eastern lands they used to
we see that.
kosher their pot every other day.
I mean, I don't know about every other day. I don't know how often they were eating meat, but like this is a thing that we see in the Nosei Kelim and the Achronim, that the separate pots, pans, utensils, everything develops much earlier in Ashkenaz than in Artsot Mizrach. But it was not the case from.
I don't see how you can
from the earliest time. It is not.
I don't see how anybody can practically run a kitchen. I don't see how anybody can practically run a kitchen on that basis. He'd have to have he or she would have to have separate pots.
I will happily send sources about this. For now, we're gonna press on with Rav Peretz. But this is a thing that we've looked at. It is a thing that like the separate dishes and stuff develops earlier in Ashkenaz, and that there is a period of time
dishes is different from pots.
No, like the whole thing. Again, I'm happy to send sources about this.
Okay.
Now, Sarah, can you read
I'll just say that the practicality of doing that depends a lot on how much, like what your resources are and how much meat you're eating. Right. And like, if you're eating a lot of meat, then it's
once a month, like that's not.
Then like, it's not so crazy, right? Or you do it only on Shabbos or something, like whatever. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, okay. Rav Peretz katav afilu eina bat yoma ubishal b'chalav asur achar kach levashel b'tchila lo basar v'lo chalav lefi shehi bolea mibasar b'chalav aval im hi shel matechet yagilena la'achar me'et le'et shel bishul sheni ve'im hi shel cheres en la takana ela shivra. Should I stop there before we get to the Rashba? Okay, so he's gonna say even if it's Eino ben Yomo, if you cooked milk in it, and then you can't lehatchila cook meat or milk in it after that, because it has absorbed like a meat milk mixture. But if it's matachet, then you can do hagala, and if it's kli cheres, no hope.
Right. If it's kli cheres, then ein la takana shvira. Although what the Yosef points out is that in Hagot Maimanio, they say in this case, it seems like you should actually be able to cook part of things in it, right? In the case where it was like Eino ben Yomo, when the thing was cooked, right? The reason that according to Rabbeinu Peretz, you shouldn't cook lichatchila, either basar or chalav in it, is because like lichatchila, the same reason that lichatchila, when you have one that has only had one of those things cooked in it and it's been more than 24 hours, you're not allowed to cook the other, gender of food. Same thing here, now that it's absorbed both, even though it hasn't become mamish basar b'chalav in, the walls, because the one was Eino ben Yomo at the time, still both of those exist now in the walls and could be expelled into the other mean, right? And so that's why
I kind of wondered whether he was saying something even stronger, which is maybe more puzzling, which is that like it actually does absorb a meat milk mixture. Right,
it seems like that from the
seems very right, but it seems very odd if that's what you say. But it does
Yeah,
know,
no, I
like,
think
it seems
from
kind
the
of
phrasing of the
cut.
Torah, it does kind of sound like that. I think nobody ends up understanding it the way that I've seen, besides potentially the phrasing of the Torah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
I just was like,
no, it is weird the fact that bluam basar bechalav as opposed to basar vechalav.
yeah. I mean, I don't know how precise like our manuscripts of the Torah are, but
Yeah.
it just seems strange to me.
Yeah, read
No,
it as a vav. Read it as a vav, not a vet.
yeah.
I suggest
Yeah.
I suggest that he said it. He said it's if you read it as a vet, no, it's a vav. It's basar v'chalav. You got to read it that way.
Yeah, well then it
Sometimes
makes
we
some
do
sense.
this with the Sofri, and we see people suggesting that vets and vavs got mixed up. Okay,
Yeah.
we're gonna look at the Rashba. So Sarah, can you keep reading in the Torah?
Correct. Katava Rashba, she'im bishal yirakot b'kdera shel basar, shemutar levashal ba'achar kach gvina shekvar nitma'it ba'koach bela habasar, v'niklash ad she'ein ra'ui lechol alav she'im isur basar bechalav. B'mei advarim amurim, keshabala heter, kemo she'amarnu, aval bala davar isur le'olam, hu be'isuro, ad she'yagil, hara'ui la'agil, le'laben, hara'ui le'laben, adkan. So the Rashba thinks in this kind of potentially shocking way that if you cooked a vegetable in between, then you can go ahead and cook cheese because the sort of whatever meat stuff was bolea into the pot has become sufficiently weakened that you don't need to worry about it. It's not sufficiently strong to create this new substance called basar bechalav. But that's only in a case where what it absorbed previously was heter. If it absorbed isar, then you have to go back to koshering it.
Right, that he thinks this like cooking your yarakot in the middle only works for this case of basar. Now you can cook chalav, but doesn't work for like I had a trace pot, I cooked yarakot in it, now I can cook anything. Okay. So we're going to look at the Beit Yosef from the Ketav HaRashba. I'm going to read the beginning of this because we're dealing with the Gemara that we looked at in Avodah Zarah. So this is kind of the whole basis of the Rashba Shita, right? So Ketav HaRashba, Shim Bishal Yerakot, right? Zeh Lashona b'Torah Beit Haruch, right? So he's going to quote the Rashba at length. Besof HaBeit HaDaled, Shaninu Perek, Batra Avodah Zarah, Hashifud V'Achsala, Melabnan Ba'or, Barminan ala begemara, Rami le Rav Amram le Rav Sheshet, Tanan hashipud v'achsala melabnan, v'hatanya gebe kodshim hashipud v'achsala magilin. Right. So we have this challenge raised, which is on the one hand we say that these like spits and whatnot need to be you need libun, right? They need to be like fired in order to be koshered. And on the other hand, we have this braita saying that you can do hagala on them. Upari Rava. Right? Rava gives this kind of wild answer, which is that like every day the kodshim being cooked on it basically affects hagala, right? Each day the koshering itself, the cooking itself is koshering the thing in the same way, right? And the thing that we're worried about here is notar, right? We're worried about flavor that remains in the thing and that will become notar if left unpurged. And he's saying each day when you cook it, you actually expel the flavor before it can become notar. Vakshinan, yihachi, hagala, nami loli bae. This alkapakushya. And then the Gemara is like, okay, well, but if that's true, right? If it's true that the cooking itself basically koshers the thing every day, then why does it say we need hagala? You shouldn't need any kind of koshering on it. And the Gemara ends with that kushya. There's not a resolution to that kushya. Shma'inan mahat dechol shebishel bo lachar mikan niflat meno ha'isor v'nichshar legamre ad shikshu amai tani b'baraita magilin shere nikal b'bishul shel yom sheni v'nichshar legamre v'kashi li tuba v'chi adif bishul de yom sheni mahagala gmora v'im hagala gmora have kashi le Rav Amram hech machshirato מה הייתה תשובתו של רבא? דאמר בכל יום ויום נעשה גיור, והלך ליבון, והלא ליבון הוא צריך, כמו ששנינו במשנתנו. Right? So like, he points out a really important thing, which is, how is Rava's question actually answering anything? He's not even really answering the kashya that Rav Amram raised, which is that, don't we need libun? And he's like, okay, well, even if you were to say that this cooking stands in the place of Hagala, that still doesn't seem to stand in the place of Libun, which is what the Mishnah says this needs, right? Ve'libun shiyu hanitzotzot minat zina yemenu, right? That the Libun is like there's sparks flying, and that's clearly not happening in the general cooking. V'od hai kamelan be'kli matechot cham miktato cham kulo she'isor hanivla mitpashet b'chol hakli. Right. And like, I think the idea is that we only think that can be kosher, therefore, then buy this full on libun if that's how it's been absorbed. Then you're right, and this is where the Rashba comes in. Rav Joel.
I wasn't sure if you meant even like full on libun or even like just cooking it. You don't full the thing up completely.
Right.
And so it's not
like proper Hagala where you're having it boiled, like completely submerged or boiled over. Like you're just kind of cooking, right? How do you know that the cooking is getting to the whole thing? Right. So now the Rashba is going to bring in his chiddush. Nireli. The hachi kamar, the kochim hetera bala, the kivan shebishel ba kodem shiavol lidei isor notar, likshiagia zmano liot chal shem notar, kavar niklash v'nichlash isor kol kach al yedei bishul ze hasheni, ad shelo nishar bo ela mu'at, v'in ra'ui lechol lav shem notar al davar balua mu'at kazeh. Okay, so this is his big thing, that since kochim, in this case, the absorbed thing is heter, right? And the issue is just we're worried about the absorbed thing becoming notar if it's left unpurged. Since the thing that when it was absorbed, it was heter. And now whatever absorbed flavor there was has been like minimized so significantly by the second like cooking. He's like, even if it can't be completely 100% expelled, the tiny remnant of what there still is, remnant is a funny term here, I guess, the tiny little bits of flavor left behind are so insignificant that like the sham of notar, that like the status of Isor can't really take effect on them, right? And so we see that's where he gets this idea of when you're dealing dafka with heter, before it has the capacity to even get to Isser, if you have cooking that weakens the amount of that heter like flavor and presence significantly, then like it's no longer kind of has the capacity to create this Isser by combination with another thing, right? And this is why the Rashba also makes it very clear that he doesn't think that this works if you have something that is already Usser, right? That the cooking, the Yerakot, and then something that's absorbed Isser doesn't work. It's about this idea of weakening heter such that it doesn't have the combination to become Isser, right? So this like haklasha only works in the case of heter absorption. Okay, that's mostly what he's going to go through in the next end of this up to Ikal and Meidak. But now the Beit Yosef is going to make a really interesting point, which is why did the Torah have such an issue with the Baal HaYitor, but just bring the Rashba stam, right? The Torah doesn't challenge the Rashba. He seems to bring him lahalacha, right? So if people see it's another in the Shirat Devorah, it's like a bolded V'ikal Meidak. V'ikal Meidak, my ika ben hai the harashba, l'mashikatav Baal HaYitor, the ika man za'amar mevashel ba min shebishel ba'achshav, kevan shatav shel mutar, tam harishon batel, v'ktira nami muteret, shurabenu tama'alav, v'lo tama'al harashba. V'en lomar da'al korcha lo shari harashba, ela bishel ba'yirakot, aval b'shel b'chalav, kahayid Baal HaYitor lo, the hakivan sheyesh bashishim lek alefluke ben chalav lirakot sharitam basar shaba eno oser b'chalav ze yoter mimashe hu oser b'yarakot v'gam en lomar delo shari harashba ela b'kli shtaf shatap I don't know which is the better aval b'kli cheresh b'li ato merubeh kedeshari Baal HaYitor. So first of all, he says one suggestion that he totally rejects as to why the difference would be is like, oh, maybe the Rashba only permitted this when it's like a pareve vegetable thing that you cooked, but the idea of the chalav being the thing that koshers it, that wouldn't work. He's like, no, it would work, right? Like according, if you believe that that's how the sort of mechanism is going, the chalav being cooked in it should work just as well, right? And the second thing he's mentioned is, oh, maybe the Rashba was only talking about with metal kalim, right? As opposed to the Baal HaYitor who is dealing with kli cheres. Right, Damashikatav Hatama, Yahiver Benu, Lemesar Bekli Cheres, Haini Mishum da Afilu Hagala lo Mahanyabeg, Shapolet Tamid Ma'at Mat, Bekli Shetav Nami, Kol Shalo Hugalu Karui, Shaya Haitama, right? So initially the Beit Yosef doesn't like the idea of distinguishing between these two, right? He's like, okay, well, a unkoshered metal kli also expels flavor, right? So like, unless you consider this to be the same as Hagala, you should actually still be worried. I'm not going to read the rest of this entirely inside. He ends up actually kind of, despite initially looking like he's going to reject this distinction, he ends up sort of accepting it, right? He ends up saying maybe it's that a kli cheres absorbs so much more flavor than a kli matechet, that a kli cheres, even after it's been hagalad, right? Even after it's been kind of koshered or cooked in, has the amount of flavor that a kli matechet before hagalad does, right? So that's the one suggestion. The other suggestion there, Rabbeinu Yerucham, is the idea that actually, even if really on a mechanical level, it does work to do this with chalav, maybe the Rashba does distinguish between Yerakot and chalav because it just doesn't seem intuitive that you could kosher a Bisari vessel with milk, right? But then this is what the Darchei Moshe ends up saying. He thinks that's the correct distinction, right? That even if like technically on a basic level of how this absorption and expelling is working, the chalav should work the same as the Yerakot. Maybe the Torah was just like, to him it felt deeply unintuitive, the idea that milk could be used to kosher a meat vessel. And that's why he took more umbrage with the Baalei Torah's position. Rav Joel?
He also makes a distinction between water and milk, right? Where he says, well, maybe only water works and you're using that to cook the vegetables. Which we'll see, right? Come back as like maybe only water works to kosher.
Correct.
Lexie, could you give us the line in Darchei Moshe, not the whole thing, but just because it's powerful. No,
Right. So
I think
the one being to do the makom makom kivan dechalav hu asor bebasar eno bedin sheyehu hagorem heter lekderat basar levashel bachalav. Right. Nonetheless, since chalav is asur with basar, it just doesn't make sense that chalav could be the thing to create a heter for a bisari pot to then cook chalav in it. Right. And again, the note of the Darchei Moshe on that is that, like, he says, whatchamacallit, that this, sorry, I forget where he is, but he ends up saying somewhere he thinks that is the Ikari Tam. Okay. Speaking of the Darchei Moshe, another thing that we only see in the Torah Nosei Kelim come up there, but that will show up in the Shulchan Aruch and Nosei Kelim, is the idea of the kisui of the pot. So if we flip back to the Darchei Moshe Aleph, we're gonna skip the first part of Aleph and pick up with Bahagahot Shari Dora, which is like, sorry, actually that's not in Aleph, that's in Bet. In Bet in the Darchei Moshe, Bahagahot Shari Dora. Yavni, can you read?
בהגות שרי דורה, כיסוי מקטרה של בשר, כיסוי מקטרה של בשר ושמו על קטרה של חלב, אסור הכל, ואין שייך נותן טעם לפגם, שהרתיחה עולה ונוגעת בכיסוי תדיר ונעשית בת יומה, העתק מקובץ, עד כאן לשונו. So Sharidura says if you have a meat pot lid and you put it on a dairy pot or a pot with milk in it, then everything is forbidden. And we can't say what about noten tam lifgam because these, I guess, because these pots are like always getting hot and therefore like it never actually has a day, but it's always getting the vapors.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure like why, like I guess it's just like used more.
If
like
you're wondering why that's different, then you're in good company
Like,
because
yeah,
a number
yeah,
of the Darchei Moshe and various of this company also think that's a silly distinction. Okay. ואני ראיתי.
ואני ראיתי כל רבותיי נוהגים כהגה זו. And I've seen that like everyone practice, all my teacher practices this way. וכן המנהג פשוט במדינתנו שאין פוסקין נותן טעם לפגם בכיסוי. And everyone seems to hold this way that you can't say נותן טעם לפגם with a pot lid. ואני אומר כי דבר זה גורם הפסד ממון ישראל, כי הוא דבר רגיל ושכיח. And I say that this is going to cause a lot of loss because loss of money because it's such a common mistake to make. והוא חומרה בלא טעם, and it's a חומרה without reason, כי מי גרה אותה רתיחה שעולה למעלה אצל הכיסוי מן הרוטב וגוף המאכל עצמו שבתוך הקדרה הוא מבשל בה. Because who said like because why should it be worse the vapors that go up and hit the pot lid than the food itself that's sitting in the pot?
Great points. Yeah.
ואין לדחוק ולומר דווקא בקדרה מותר נותן טעם לפגם, דאפשר דאף אגב דפגום פולט מעט, דפגום פולט מעט ומיד שנפלט נתבטל במאכל, ולכן הפליטה אינה מתקבצת הרבה יחד עד שתחשוב לדבר חשוב, ומקרי לפגם ושרי. So, and we shouldn't, like, maybe you might think to explain this by saying that in the Kedera, it's only mutar because even though it is giving a bad flavor, it's like only exuding from the pot a little at a time, and therefore it never has time to accumulate into something that could be considered like an important thing to be giving flavor. אבל גבי הכיסוי דמה שנפלט מן הכיסוי אינו נופל מיד למאכל ואינו מתבטל מיד ומתקבץ יחד על הכיסוי נחשב דבר חשוב כאילו היה בן יומו. Whereas in the pot lid, you might think that, oh, because it's not like, it doesn't have the food in it, it has time to, the stuff that has been absorbed into the pot lid has time to accumulate on the pot lid, but until it's like a more substantial thing, and before it falls into the pot, and therefore it's, and therefore would be considered like it becomes like an actual thing. It becomes, and so it's like considered as if it were within a day. זה סברה רחוקה מאוד ואינה כלל, דאם כן הווה טעמא דנותן טעם לפגם שרי משום דמיד שנפלט מתבטל, ולא מכוח שהוא פגום ואינו נותן טעם. Because that's a ridiculous explanation, because if it were so, then our whole reasoning around noten tam nifgam would actually be based on this idea that it's only exuding a little bit at a time and it's actually batel.
Right. This is going to go on to like prove this more extensively, but he's like, it's very clear that noten tam nifgam, the point isn't that, oh, there's just a little bit of it, so it's fine. It's that it's because it's pagum. It's fine. It's not bitul, it's pagum. So there's no reason to distinguish of like, oh, it's gathered up more in the kisui, there's more absorbed. That wouldn't be different. He also makes the good point of, he's like, if it was really that a kisui can never be eno ben yomo, then the Gemara should have said that the reason you can't use an eno ben yomo pot isn't zero atu like ben yomo pot, it's zero atu kisui ever. Right? That if a kisui is always considered ben yomo, then yeah, you shouldn't be able to use an eno ben yomo pot because you might just stick a ben yomo kisui on it, right? And that like that should be the concern, right? In fact, the Gemara doesn't say that. It seems like probably this isn't true. And he goes on extensively with this. He ends up basically again being like, personally, I'm not going to tell people where the minhag is to treat it this way to stop doing it, but like seriously, like hameki lo hifsid. And if I had the power, I would stop this minhag because I think it's silly. The Rama really does not like it. And then he quotes something that we'll see brought in the Rama itself, which is the Isser V'Heter, saying that when you take a hot hot cover and put it on a cold pot, if you remove that before we get some heat lifting up to the pot, then everything is completely mutar, right? There's not both the cover and the thing below it and all the food, everything is 100% mutar, because it's the case of like right, it's tata gavar, the bottom thing is cold, and he points out that he's like, this is different than, for example, like ibrui mikli rishon, because it's really like the case of nifsaka kiluach, right? There's like this separation of when the cover was on a hot direct source and it was like nifsak, and now it's being put here. right? So it's not considered like kli rishon kind of heat, such that it would even be osar kedei ksiva. I don't know how much we'll see this inside, but other people don't love the idea that it would be completely mutar. There's some disagreement around that. I think we're gonna pause here and we're gonna pick up with the Shulchan Aruch and Nosei Kelim in 5 minutes. Okay, so we're picking up with the Shulchan Aruch. Cool. Who hasn't read in a hot sec? Jess, are you there? Can you read Aleph in the Shulchan Aruch? Wait, for some reason, Jess, I can't hear you. Can other people hear Jess? Sorry. Wait, can you try speaking again?
Does this work?
Oh,
Testing.
okay, yeah. Great.
Great. Okay. כדרך שבשל בה בשר, לא יבשל בה חלב, ואם בשל בה בתוך מי לעת, אסור בנותן טעם, מספיק לשער נגד כל הגדרה. בשל בה בשר תוך... אבל אם שהרי לעת קודם שבשל בה, הווה לנותן טעם לפגם, ומותר התבשיל, אבל הגדרה אסורה לבשל בה לא בשר ולא חלב.
Okay. So, translate up to there before we get into the long Haggah.
So basically a pot that you can't put milk in it. If you did and it was within 24 hours, then it's forbidden with notin tam. And if that 24 hours had passed, then we assume it's notin tam nifgam, so the food is permitted, but we still consider that pot forbidden for either meat or milk.
And the Machaber adds in the words he'd been mad at the Torah for excluding, which is binotain tam, as opposed to just saying asor. Okay, now we're gonna have a longer mat, where also the shach on this just points out something that I think we noted earlier, which is that if you know, it's not just that if the pot is new and you know the amount of meat that was ever cooked in it, that you can just measure against that. But even if the pot isn't new, but you know for sure the amount of meat cooked in the last 24 hours, you can just measure against that. Okay, so now let's look at aval.
אבל שהדברים מותר, בדין כיסוי קדרה כדין קדרה עצמה, ויש לך מחמירים בכיסוי למד אף על פי שאינו בן יומו, דינו כאילו היה בן יומו, וכן נוהגים בקצת מקומות, וכן אני רחק מפני המנהג, והוא חומרה בלא טעם. ומכל מקום, במקום שיש שום צד להתיר, בלאו הכי או שהוא לצורך שבת או הפסד, יש להתיר אם אין הכיסוי בן יומו כמו בקדרה עצמה.
Okay, pause there, just 'cause it's very long.
Great, okay. And so the Haggah adds the other things would be permitted.
Right, so this
and
is like the amendment on the Rabbeinu Peretz Shita, right, where he says that like even if you cooked it after 24 hours, you still lechatchila can't cook meat or dairy in this pot again, but you could cook your eklutz. Okay.
Yeah, and then we go to the saucepan lids. So no matter how long the saucepan lid was used, the minhag is not to use it. And the Rama thinks this is a completely unreasonable minhag, but he does it anyway. And if you're in a place where there's any kind of like reason to permit, or they don't have the minhag, or there's hefsed, anything like that, then a saucepan lid that hadn't been used for 24 hours would certainly be fine.
Right. So he initially starts off being like, by saying what actually his opinion is, which is that the dean of the kisui is just like the Deah. Then he's like, okay, but yes, we have this annoying minhag where people don't treat it that way and say even if it's Eino Ben Yomo, it's all usher. But really, even if that's your minhag, if there's any reason to be makil, go for it. Okay, so now he's going to get more into the logistics of this.
ואם לקחו כיסוי רותח מכדר של בשר, נתנו אותו על כדר של חלב, אם שניהם חמים, שניהם אסורים. אם יש מאכל בקדרה של בשר וחלב, ואם הכיסוי צונן והקדרה חמה, נמי שניהם אסורים. אם התחיל להזיע תחת הכיסוי, התצה כבר. ואם הכיסוי חם והקדרה צוננת, הכל שרי, רק המאכל צריך קליפה. אם אפשר לקליפה, ואם לאו, הכל שרי. ואם לא היה מאכל בקדרה, הכל שרי תהווה כשתי קדרות שנגעו זו בזו.
Okay.
So you've got two saucepans which are both on the boil, and one's meat and one's milk. If they're both hot and you've put the lids the other way around, then both lids are going to be forbidden. And so if there's food in the pots, then if the lid is cold and the pot is hot, then they would still both be forbidden. And if it started to like steam under the lid, then we go by the principle that, tatikva, so the lower one prevails. And if the lid is hot but the pot is cold, then everything is permitted because that would, because of tatikva. But you would like peel the food if it's peelable, and if it's not, then it's still fine. And if there wasn't food in the pots, then everything is fine. Because then it's just like two pots which touch each other.
Right. The Ramah says that just pots touching each other without any liquidy food things going on, they don't have the capacity to oser one another. And we won't get deep into it, but a lot of the Nosikanim disagree. The Ramah takes the Isser V'Hater's stance, right? This idea that if the kisui is hot and the pot is cold, that the kisui and the pot are both totally permitted. Whereas a lot of these other ones say, no, there's going to be some lachbul chit, there's going to be some like moisture on the kisui, and that should have the capacity to oser the pot. Okay. There's a lot of taz that we're not going to do inside. One thing in the long taz and Aleph is he tries to give his own defense of the Baal HaItor, where in a similar vein to his father-in-law, but different kind of okimta, right? If you recall, the Bach tried to suggest that the Baal HaItor thinks that the chumra of kli cheres only applies to Isser, but not to when it's absorbed heter. And the Taz suggests the Baal HaItor thinks the chumra of kli cheres only applies to kodshim, but not to chulin, right? Because the whole gzerat katuv is from kodshim, right? So where do we know that the same thing would apply to chulin? Which again is not a popularly accepted opinion, but it's a smart suggestion as to how to hatzdik it Baal HaItor. Okay, but now we're gonna look at the Taz bet, because he's gonna give another explanation for why we would treat the kisui differently that we haven't seen yet. So Joel, could you read the Behu Chomer below them?
Yes.
So could you say again what Joel was reading?
We're looking at bet in the Taz, Behu Chomer below tam.
All right, V'hu chumra b'lotam. This is about the kisui. Rashal perkol basar siman such and such katav shikara chumra davka beotan kisuyim shehem kitzarim lamala yesh bahem chalal v'yivshar lekan cham yafe min haraticha she'ole l'sham dechol sheyesh isur ba'ain lo mina beinotan tam nifgam So this is talking about the geometry of the of certain kisuyim, right? Where they are very sort of short up top, right? And they have this like gap in them. I wasn't quite sure of the geometry, but I
think
do
it's
know
like
that
there's a little hole at the top, right? Like it's too narrow to kind of fit anything into.
yeah, I was thinking it's similar to kind of our modern pots where they often have like they kind of have folds in them and there's like little crevices in those folds kind of idea, like a little different, but that's similar idea. Maybe
I
in
think
the
there's a
modern kind of
hole. I think
context.
it's right. It's like
And
there's
then
a
and then
volume
thought
that's created.
it's a gap. Yeah.
I think it's.
So
I don't think it's a
whatever it
gap in
is,
the
there's a
material. I think it's a volume that's created in the shape. Like it's.
oh, you think it's
I don't think halal refers to like the space inside, not a
I think
hole.
the halal is just right. I think it's just like the hole that things aren't able to reach into, right? That it gets
Yeah,
narrow,
Right, like a
around
crevice, like
the
right.
and there's some kind of hole that nothing can get into to clean properly.
mhm. So that's right. And so therefore it's not Tom Leaf-Gum anymore, right? Because it's actually Bain, right? Or Bain. So to credit to Rav Nachum on the pronunciation. Aval bekisui rachav shechola yad lishlot sham lekaneach yafeh mutar kol shehu eno ben yomo adkan. But if it's something where you can actually clean it, right? You can actually wipe it well. You have like enough room to get in there and wipe it. That follows the regular rules of eno ben yomo. So, okay. ונראה לנו דעתי לנהוג בזה שיש לשער אם יש בתבשיל 60 נגד מקום הקצר שבכיסוי, אז אין שום חשש איסור בכיסוי תפי מקדרה, right? And so I think that it's a question of how big is that halal, right? If you have 60 against the halal, then for sure you've done beetle on the amount of food that would have been stuck in there, and then that'd be fine. So. גם רמי בלבוש כתב שאין לחומרה של כיסוי מקום כלל. All right. And also in the Levush, he says that there's no שאין חומרה של כיסוי מקום, there's like no place for this chumrah at all, is what he's saying.
Yeah, I think it's like the chumrah below tam kind of thing.
Yeah. So
There's nothing to it.
Umori v'chami zal katav, we saw the bach katav tam l'chumra the kisui kevan sheret. Oh, we didn't see this bach. Kevan shetiriticha oles sham tamid nidbak meod v'yeshol lekancho hetev. Right, and he says that it's because you always have the reticha going up, and it's so stuck to this thing that it's like never going to be cleaned off properly. All right. Mutamua de'akderan nidbak sham mamashut hamachal. Right, but because the pot itself has like actual like food stuck to it. V'lami graki suimena. Ela she'en. So I got to turn the page. Makom l'chumazo yoter mima shehechmir rashal. B'chol misha omer tzvarot leachmir bazeh masha lo nimsa b'talmud poskim alav raya. He says that doesn't, right. There's no way kisui can be any worse than pots, which are really hard to clean, have stuff stuck to them, right? And we can't be, there's no chumrah other than what the Rashal says about the places you can't clean in it. And anybody who thinks they have a chumrah, prove it to me. So
you see that there's a lot of resistance to this chumrah in the sense of like it doesn't have much to it. But also again, most people not saying they're going to completely do away with it because it has become minhag pashut. Right. So just other brief things to note in the Siman. An interesting thing in the Pri Megadim on the note about, if you recall, on the case of the Rabbeinu Peretz position that the Mechaber adopted, which is that even if you cooked milk in an Eino Ben Yomo meat pot, you can't cook either meat or milk in it afterwards. But the Rama added, right, that Me'aker Hadin, you should be able to cook parv stuff in it, right? You can cook your akutz. And the Pri Megadim is like, but the minhag is that we don't cook anything in it until you've koshered it. That like, which I think is certainly how people today would behave. That if you accidentally like cooked milk in your fleshing pot, I think almost no one would be like, oh well, but I can cook my spinach in it now. Like people would just be like, I need to kosher that pot. And then this continuation of the Taz gets into a really interesting bit from the Rihal Lavan that we didn't look at inside, where he talks about the idea of things absorbing stuff while cold, right? The idea that new kalim can absorb some amount of like liquid that's cold in under 24 hours, right? Even just while just sitting in it for like a few hours. But that once it's had a certain amount, like sabeh milivloa, once it's like had like been filled 3 separate times and emptied out, the thing is going to have no space left to absorb, right? And so if you just have some milk sitting in it overnight, we don't worry about then cooking meat in that the next day, right? Because we don't think it'll have absorbed that milk overnight, right? And the Taz basically takes task the Lavush, who uses this reasoning to say, even if you left the milk in there me'etz la'etz, it would be fine. And the Taz is like, that's a totally different, that's kavush, right? Kavush k'mavushal, right? How could you ever say that we have kavush b'kelim if we say that like any time a thing is old, it just doesn't absorb? He makes the point. He's like, no, like the way it works is that when there's anything that we consider to be cooking, right? Whatever is in the kli, some of that gets expelled. It makes some room for more to be absorbed, right? So the Taz is like, if something was in there for 24 hours or more, it would be absorbed into the kli, and that would be a problem, right? And the Riyah Lavan was only saying this like Delilah, when it was like a less than 24-hour period. Then the kli doesn't absorb. And the Shach points out that we actually just don't pass like the Riyah Lavan at all. So it's all a fun theoretical discussion. Okay, let's turn to Tzadi Zayin in the Torah. So now Tzadi Zayin is a fun one because it's all about kind of these fences that we build around the Basar V'Challah, right? This whole Siman is focused on how do we avoid tripping people up? How do we avoid getting close to the possibility of eating basar and chalav together by not sort of contaminating presumably parve foods? So Sarah, can you read in the Torah in Lashin?
Yeah. Ein lashin b'chalav, shama yavo la'achla im habasar, v'im lash kol ha'isa asura, afilo la'achla levada. V'i avdi'enhu ke'in Torah, share. Perish Rashi, shalo lash ela davar mu'at, uga ktana. V'rav alpas piresh, sha'asaba hen shinui, perush surot ke'in hashur, v'chayotze bo, shemitoch kach yizkor, sheyesh bo chalav. So you shouldn't make milchik bread because you might come to eat it with meat. But if you do that, you need to make some kind of heker so you know. Rashi thinks that the heker that's being described is you just make them super small, like an ox's eye. And the Rif thinks that you like sort of make a little thing on top that kind of looks
Right, that you just change the shape somewhat.
You change the shape in some way so that it's obvious, and then
right. And Rashi also explains that the idea is like if you make it small, you'll eat it all at once, right? So there's no.
Right, so you're not going to be dipping it in your bread or whatever, in your meat or whatever.
Right. Whereas the Rif seems to be saying like, no, actually, you could even make a lot of it as long as like it's like visibly something that you'll be reminded that this is chalavi or bisari, then it'll be fine. Right, but it is like a strong chumrah where we say that like actually we're so worried about people getting these things mixed up that like if you don't do that, if you don't do the kind of heker, like if you've made milk like bread, you cannot eat it. Like it is usher to eat even by itself. And sorry, Yavni, did you have a comment?
Oh, I was just gonna say that I feel like the language of heker is like the Rif's opinion, and Rashi, I don't know that it's about a heker for him so much as about like, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Right. It's more just like it's so small, you're not gonna.
Some poskim also use that as a heter to eat at a smorgasbord, a milchik smorgasbord or something. Anyway, a very small, something made very small, because it's a gurnet. It's really, it could even be milchik. That's how they talk. Could even be milchik. So therefore, if you know, so fun.
That was the thing with English muffins too, right?
With what?
English muffins, right? English muffins.
No, yeah, no. I yearly, whenever we come to it, Dunkin' Donuts, the original Dunkin' Donuts, because in from neighborhoods they never had cakes that were milchik, unless it was a cheesecake, which you knew it was milchik. So the mazonos, look, you can bench after mazonos, right? So what about Dunkin' Donuts? So Dunkin' Donuts at one point had a parva and had a regular, I had a milchik, but they made the milchik with a little, what would you call it? Not a hook, a
Ox's
a
eye. Yeah.
a little, sorry, a little way of dunking it, a little piece of dough that extended, and you would pick it up and you would dunk it in your coffee. In old time New York, everyone dunked their Dunkin' Donuts in their coffee at the automat, at the kosher automat. And that's what they did. They made a hecker, Dunkin' Donuts.
Right. And people, whatever, there's lots of stuff about this in the modern day, for example, with the berekas and their different shapes being legislated, so you know what's halavi or not.
Right,
Okay,
the only kafiyah datita makes sense.
great.
Wait,
Now we're going to
what-
continue.
Wait, Lexie, what you said that the dough, if somebody did make bread that was milchik, you couldn't eat it?
Yeah.
Where'd you see that?
Im lash kol ha'isa asura, afilu la'achla levada.
Where is that? Oh, that's the tour?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right, that he says, and again, and if you make this, unless you create a certain heker, it's usher to eat even by itself. Okay, and then in that, we're going to see a similar continuation, but with the Disari concern. So Sarah can keep reading in Tachin.
Ein tachin hatanor ba'aliyah, v'im tach kol apad asura, afil la'achla levada. Ela im kin hisik hatanor tchila yafeh, she'az palat hakol, afil hu shel cheres, מהדברים אמורים, בתנור שהסיקו בפנים, אבל בוכיה שהסיקו בחוץ, אסור, אלא אם כן מלואו גחלים מבפנים עד שיתלבן. So you shouldn't, how do you say tach in English? You shouldn't like coat the sides of your oven with tail fat, thereby making fleishik bread, because they would like actually like slap the bread on the side of the oven. And then if you do that, it's usur to eat it even by itself, unless you like have really seriously like cleaned off or scraped off that oven.
But you've like heated the
Right, unless you've heated it up.
Self-cleaning cycle.
Right, you basically run it on you've heated it up sufficiently that whatever was absorbed into the wall when you coated it in the tail fat is now gone. But if it's cheres, and that works even if it's cheres. But that's the kind of oven where you are like the heating element is inside it as opposed to the heating element being outside of it. And if it's the kind that has a heating element outside, then you have to fill it with coals until it does libun.
Right. So again, this is a similar concern to the milk, but just again, the other thing that we're worried about, you also shouldn't make Bisari pot. All right, and then Rabbeinu Tom explains, he raises the fair question, which is that why can't you just clean the oven? Why can't you just wipe it down? Why do you need to basically kosher it? And his answer was like, Aliyah is so like smeary and whatever that like you actually can't really reliably clean it off just by trying to wipe it down, right? That the hasaka is the only way of guaranteeing it gets removed. Okay. And now this final bit will be a callback to an earlier siman. Yavni, can you read Katav Harashba?
כתב הרשב"א פת שאפו בתנור עם הבשר, יש מהגאונים שאסרו לאכול אותה הפת שריחו כטעמו, לאכול אותה הפת שריחו כטעמו, ויש מתירין וכן נראה, עד כאן. So the Rashba says that if you bake bread with like in the oven with meat, there are those who forbid it because fragrance is like taste, and there are those who permit it, and he thinks that it should be permitted. וכן פסק רש"י דריחא לאו מילתא היא ומותר לאוכלו אפילו בחלב. And Rashi says that fragrance is nothing, and therefore it's permitted to eat it even with dairy. ורבנו תם פסק דרך המילתא היא, ומי הוא דווקא בתנור קטן, כמו שלהם, אבל בתנורים שלנו הגדולים. Sorry. Share. And Rabbeinu Tam says, no, in principle, reicha is something, but it is only a something that you really have to worry about if you have a small oven like they must have had back then. But our big ovens, you don't have to worry about it. וכתב בספר המצוות, ופרשו לי רבותיי, המחזיק 12 עשרונים זהו תנור גדול. And the tool gives a size for a big oven.
Right. So this is again some chazara on what we've seen before with Reicha Miltahi, but looking at some specifics of how this plays out with Basar and Chalav. Right. So we just talked about the cases of when you mamish make like, milchig or fleishig like pot. What's the deen? Now the question is, if you cook pot again in the same oven, does that make it fleishig enough that you couldn't eat it with dairy? Or again, potentially at all. Look at the Bach on the very beginning of the Bach Gimel. Yavni, can you read the Pirush Diyesh Magonim?
Sure, just to find it. פירוש דיש מהגאונים, אסרו לאכול אותו הפת עם החלב וכולי, אבל עם הבשר ודאי שרי, דלא דמי לתח את התנור בעלייה, דאיקה גוף הבשר, וטעמו בפת. אבל הכא דליקה אל הריחה, לא אמרו דריחו כטעמו, אלא שלא לאכלו עם חלב. So the Rashba says that so the Bach says that the Rashba means that the Gonim forbade eating this bread that has taken in the scent of the meat that it was cooking with, to eat it with milk, but surely you can eat it with meat. That's that opinion.
Right. That he's pointing out, he's like, the Bach finds it hard to believe that we would treat that even the more machmir position on Reicha Milta would treat it the exact same as literally like, kneading dough with milk, right? So he's like, even the more machmir position is just that like you shouldn't eat it with milk, but you could still eat this with basar. We're not going to say it's usher to eat, period, like the milky dough. Okay. So we're not going to go through the entirety of like inside Rav Joel.
But the Torah doesn't sound like he says that, right? The Torah sounds like
the Torah doesn't clarify that. Dafka from what does seem like he's reading the Rashba as being like that opinion is the Gaonian opinion is that's usher to eat at all, right? From the fact that he says that Rashi permits it even to eat it with milk, right? It seems like he believes there's an opinion of not eating it at all. The Bach seems to find that hard to believe. Okay, right. So just like to resituate us in the Reicha Milta situation, we had the two main sugyot that come on it, right? There's the Rav and Levi one about nevela and shchuta being cooked together, where Levi is the one saying Reicha Lav Miltahi and Rav is the one saying Reicha Miltahi. And we have Abaye and Rava who are dealing with this bat tiha, this bunghole of Avodah Zarah wine. And Rava is the one saying Reicha Lav Miltahi, and Abaye is the one saying Reicha Miltahi. And because of these both the combination of these two different sugyot and the continuation of the Rav and Levi one, where we get some just kind of stam sak that's not disagreed with, there is a big sort of dispute as to how we paskin, right? So Rashi says we paskin like Rava. Rava says Reicha Lav Miltahi, therefore Reicha Lav Miltahi. Good and done. Whereas the Tosfot think that actually there's this like hierarchy, right? They're like these sugyot, like these situations are not created equal, right? That like actually even Rava would agree that in some situations Reicha is a milta, and just not the one that he and Abaye were dealing with. And so Rashi seems to just paskin lichatchila Reicha Lav Miltahi. That seems to be the pshat of Rashi. The Rif and the Rambam paskin like Levi, that Reicha Lav Miltahi, but they qualify it a bit. They say that it's a b'diavad opinion, right? They say that lechatchila you cannot create one of these situations of Reicha, but if you did, it's permitted, right? And then at the very end of the sugya, it gives the examples of, it just says stam, right? The case of the pot that was baked with meat, you can't eat with chalav, or fish that was baked with meat. Again, you also can't eat with chalav. And those things are just said stam, right? Which some people use to prove that we should paskin like Rav, right? From the fact that we just had these unchallenged opinions at the end of the sugya that seem to think recha is a milta, it seems like we do think that's a concern. The Rif actually paskins like these, despite generally saying recha lav milta. So some of the people commenting on the Rif try and explain why is it that he generally thinks recha lav milta, but he does paskin this way with the pot. So we're gonna look at the Beit Yosef Gimel Bet, right? Gimel parentheses Bet. It's the Harosh v'Perak Batra de Vodazara. And Rav Joel, could you read?
Yes, from the beginning.
Yeah.
All right. Varosh perak batra devodah zara hevi divrei Rashi v'divrei Rabbeinu Tam v'lo yichriya b'neihem. Right. So Rosh doesn't decide between Rabbeinu Tam says recha miltahi and Rashi says it's not. V'Rabbeinu katav v'siman kufchet shmaskenat harosh ki Rabbeinu Tam. Right. But later on in Tarovot, which we saw, right, the tour Paskin is like says that his father Paskin is like Rabbeinu Tam. I don't know where he got this from. And it might be that because he brings Rabbeinu Tam last, right? That was his. Sorry, we're in the Beit Yosef. It's Gimel parenthetical bet in the Beit Yosef. So about 3 lines in. All right. Ve'arif beperak gid hanasheh pasak Levi damar recha lav miltahi. All right, so the Reef Paskins like Levi, Rechad not milta mihu katav de adkan lo shari Levi ela b'diavad. But he said that's only a b'diavad case, just like Rav Lexie just said. Avol lo lechatchila dehashit sala o kamar v'lo kamar solin lechatchila. Because if you look right, Levi, the comment is that they cooked in the past tense, and it doesn't say that they, in the participle form that they.
Although a challenge that other Rishonim raise on the Rif is that in the Yerushalmi, the Levi just does in fact say solid. So it does in fact seem like Levi thinks it's a lechatchila opinion, but the Rif doesn't take into account that Yerushalmi.
All right. V'chatav ba'od v'hadatani Rav Kahana pat she'af'ah im hatzli asur leochla im hakutach ve'ahi benita di'itvaya behade bisra ve'asra Rava Rava mi wherever they're from lemichla bekudcha lav kerav belechud. Right, so all those cases where they have the isur of eating these things together, one that was cooked with something else, then eat with the opposite gender of thing. That's they're even like Levi, they're paskening. The lechatchila you can't do it. All right, Mike Tama kevan deshar lemichlenu below kutcha. Oh yeah, why are they saying that? Because since you could eat it without the kutach, right? If I cooked my something with in an oven with meat, right? I don't have to eat it with yogurt necessarily. And so that would be like just like the person who permits to eat. The person's permitting to eat with kutach would be just like the one who says that you're allowed to what's the other roast basar shchuta with nevela lechatchila, right? So it'll be lechatchila case, and therefore you can't do it. All right. So that's the reason why certain people are oser, because you don't have to eat it with milk. You can just eat it by itself, and not the case of like if I cook meat and dairy in the same oven, for instance, which would be a different.
This is
case.
actually where we get the language there refuses. He describes the bread as davar sheish lo matirin, which is a very weird use of that term, and leads to that fascinating Ran that we looked at earlier in the year about how the rabbis versus Rabbi Yehuda are defining min b'mino, min b'she'eno mino. So slight tangent, but a great Ran. But now we're going to look at some other Ran where he's talking about what might be special about this case.
Ran katav tam acher dekivan shereach habasar nirgash bahem hato'en otam yeh savur shemamashlo shel basar nivla bahen v'chi achiluhu bechurcha mitchaze kevasar b'chalav. Right, so the Ran says, no, you're going to taste it. And it's going to taste like meat. You're going to feel the meat taste in it from the recha, right? Not right, and you're going to be like, you're gonna say it must have been that there actually was basar that was in this thing, and then when I eat with yogurt, it's gonna look as if I'm eating basar b'chalav. All right, mishum hachi asur,
Not even
and that's
look,
why
it's
it's
gonna
asur mashe.
right? It's not gonna look
Yeah.
like that. I will in my mouth have the taste of basar and challah, and I know what basar tastes like, and I'll be able to notice that in my pot, and I'm eating my kutach, and suddenly I have both of those tastes in my mouth, even if there's no mama shoot of the basar taste.
But great, which is mashe and give basar shchuta b'sal'a im basar nevela she'en recha v'tama shel nevela nergash b'shchuta klal. But if I have two types of meat together, one is kosher, one's not kosher, right? I'm not going to know. It's not going to feel as if I ate, nevela meat, right? It's not. I won't know. Ve'od she'efshar shechumra hu shechmiru b'basar b'chalav yoter mishar yisurim, right? Mishum delad badili in shemine. It's possible that this whole thing of recha is actually more applicable basar b'chalav because each of them is permitted apart, and we don't avoid chalav, we don't avoid basar, and therefore, so we're more machmir on them together in terms of a recha context than we would be on shar isurim. Kemoshich mirobo shelo lahaloto im basar al shulchan. Right, Masha'en kemishar isurim adkan. Like the same way we have a greater chumrah on bringing basar and chalav to the same table, which we don't have with, I guess, if I'm eating with my non-Jewish friend, then I bring his pork up. He puts his pork on the table, and I'm eating my whatever it is that's kosher. We don't have a takana about that. All right, keep going.
No, I think we're gonna pause there. There's an interesting note. I forget if the very last bit in the Beit Yosef, the very last bit before Tzadichet, Katav HaIgor. This is just kind of a funny bit, which I think gets to an interesting question that we have around how we deal with the Chatchila and B'diavad kind of definitions. Do people see that where it says Katav HaIgor? Like the very last subsection in the Beit Yosef. Right, so he says, Katav Igor, Nishal Mahari Mulin, Al Pachin Afa'im Tzeli Shal Goy, B'diavad, V'hishiv Rav Poskim, Pasku Derecha Lav Miltahi, B'tanarim Shalanu, Im Yesh Pat Acheret, Da'atino Te, Dechashuv Kamo Lechatchila, V'lama Tanyacha Heter, V'tochali HaIsur, V'im Yesh Dochek, Limso Pat Acheret, Yesh Tismo Al HaMaskirim, Akan Lashano, right? That there's a question of all right, I've had some bread that's been cooked with some nevela. What's the deal? It's even it's in a big oven where recha isn't even such an issue. What, can I eat this? And the answer was well, if you have other bread, you should ideally eat that bread. But if this is your only bread, then fine. And the Beit Yosef goes, Ve'edver of Nirim Beinai, Diavad mutar gamorhu. Ve'filu yesh pat acheret lefanav, mutar le'achol mizo. He's this doesn't make sense to me because the whole point is that lichatchila, you're not supposed to create this situation, but we're saying that b'diavad, it is kosher, right? What do you mean? Eat the heter and leave the iser. This isn't iser, right? We say b'diavad, it is just mutter, right? So once we say this, the b'diavad situation has already been created, the bread has already been cooked with the thing. There should be no difference between eating this bread and eating another thing. I think it's an interesting point again when we get to the certain ways we define the lechatchila.
No, it's very important. I think this is great how you said it because in a diavad, you don't have to be choshesh for lechatchila. You're not in a second. Before it's diavad, you have to be choshesh for lechatchila. In fact, you have to live a lechatchila life in general. I should even hedge on this. You should read all life to be lechatchila. Say it that way. But good part of life is b'diavad. Okay, this is one of the great. The other great thing about it is that it's an expurgation of Jewish guilt. You don't have to be good. It's a b'diavad situation. You don't have to feel guilty about it.
All right, let's flip to the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, and when we're there, Jess, can you read from the beginning the in Lashin?
Yeah, just finding. Not just finding. If someone else is ready there, that might. Oh no, I've got it. No, okay. אין נשים עיסה בחלב, שמה יבוא לאכלה עם בשר, ואם לש כל הפת אסור, אפילו לאכלה בלבדה, ואם היה דבר מועט, כדי אכילה בבת אחת, או ששינה בצורת הפת שתהא ניקת, שלא יאכל בה בשר, מותר, כי יוצא בה אין אופין פת בתנו שתחול בעליה, ואם אפילו דינו כאיסה שנילה בחלב.
Okay, so that's all
So
pretty straightforward from the Torah. What's one thing? How does he paskin vis-a-vis Rashi and the Rif?
So he takes the Sharidura's approach that like both are fine.
Yeah, he says like either or, right? Either can be small or it can be not small but recognizable. Okay, so now we're gonna get some fun stuff about how they made bread on holidays from the Ramah.
וכן נוהגים ללשפט עם חלב בחג השבועות, גם בשומן לכבוד שבת, כי כל זה מחשב כדבר מועט, גם ביצותן משונה משפט, וכל שכן פלדין או פשטידה דמוטוין, ואין נפות שום פת עם פלדין או פשטידה בתנור דחיישינן שמה יזוב מן השומן על הפת, ואם זב תחתיו דינו כאילו מילוש עמו, נוהגים לשום התפלה בפי התנור, ואפילו הוא במחבת נוהגים להחמיר התחילה.
Okay.
So they make special dairy bread for Shavuot, and they make special meat fat bread for Shabbat sometimes, and that's considered a small thing. Or like might have a different shape, and like breads with fillings of various sorts are permitted, but you shouldn't bake them in the same oven as normal bread because we worry about the taste transference.
Mm-hmm. Right, that we're worried about these like drippings from these things onto the bread or into the area surrounding the bread. So look at the
Jessica, is that an English thing? Breads with fillings.
Right.
I was in Leeds. They were selling in the kosher bakery on the Fleischig years on the Fleischig side. Pasties.
It's not an pasties are an English thing. They're a Cornish thing. I don't know if I'd call that bread exactly. I think that would definitely be a mizunot situation for me. But
okay, we're gonna look at the shach bets because he's gonna get into a little bit more of these ideas. What are we worried about with the dripping? So for the sake of time, I'm gonna read. We have ein la'afot, right? So this was on the don't bake bread with the fladin of the pashtida. Pirush l'chachila ein la'afot shum pat im fladin u pashtida betanor afilu rachav ve'eno mishupa l'chayshinon shema yizov imenu al hapat. Right, that like we shouldn't cook these things together, even if the tanor is wide and not on an incline at all. Yes, for the mishpat. I'm trying to remember if that's is it that we're worried about the thing, or is it that we're worried about the amount? Thoughts? Yeah, I think it's the incline, right? That we're worried about whether it's going to automatically be dripping down or whether that's like going to be incidental, right? So even if it's not those things, you shouldn't. Because again, it still might drip onto the pot. Right, but like again, if it's not on an incline or the bread is on top of the thing that we're worried about dripping, we're not going to assume this isser of shemazav. Maybe it dripped. Even if it did drip, it didn't drip directly under the bread. אבל אי חזינן דזב מן הפשטידה לחוץ, אפילו אינו זב תחת הפת עצמו, אלא הפת רחוק מן הפשטידה, Pat asur af diavad. Right? But if we do see that it dripped, even if it's not right where the pot was, we still say that even b'diavad, the pot can't be eaten. K'di'ita b'haga v'haghot Yoreh. והגה הספר ההתר, הערוך, כלל המנטט בשם אור זרוע, כל זה מוכח בתורת חטאת, דדדדה ודוד. וטעם לדבר נראה לי, משום דמיסף גלן, אי בישול מפעפע בכל הכלי ולא. Right, this is a harkening back to our previous thing. We're wondering, does the thing really spread throughout the entirety of the vessel that it's falling onto? ויוכח היכדלו חזינן דזב, איכא ספק ספקה. ספק זב ולא זב, ואם תמצא לומר זב, right? That like if we don't see the thing actually dripping at all, then the pot is mutar from a safek speka, right? Maybe it didn't even drip. And if it did drip, maybe it didn't spread to the area where the pot is. Right? That like when it's on an incline, we say that like if it did drip, we assume that it would have dripped to where the pot is. And again, when we saw that it dripped, then we only had this fake of whether it spread. Sham katav b'shem or zarua. De below ra'a dezav ika balav hachi safek speka safek zavulo im timtzela marzav shema lo yachluim chalav. He's like, there's another opinion of how you could do a safek speka, which is that if you didn't see that it dripped, maybe it did or didn't drip. And if it did, and it did like, impact the bread, maybe it won't be eaten with milk, right? Shema lo chashiv hai de shema. Shema lo chashiv hai. The shema lo yachloim chalav laharav spega klal. Hevan directly lo to lachol pat im komine ochlim is like, I don't think that doesn't count as a shema, right? People eat pot all the time with all sorts of foods. Right? It's not a strong enough suffix because people really eat bread all the time with all the things. The suffix of, oh, maybe he won't eat with the chalaf is just not a strong enough one. Right? Right? That it seems like if we read the Ramah closely, it seems like the Ramah is only worried, at least b'diavad, about if it dripped to right where the pot is. Right, whereas the shach thinks that if it dripped at all, the pot is forbidden. Okay, we're gonna pause there. Now we're gonna look. There's a fun Taz where he relates his interactions with a woman who cooks things. On the end of this Ramah, right? So at the end of the Ramah, he was saying even if the things are kind of in their own little pan, right? L'chachila, you shouldn't cook it together with the pot. So Sarah, can you read the Taz Gimel, afilu hu b'machavat?
Yeah. Afilu hu b'machavat. Nish'alti b'isha she'afha pladin shel gvina b'tanur al hakarka shelo v'lo kli. V'acharkach sama sham k'deira shel basar rotachat al oto makom she'haya hapladin. Okay, so the situation is you went and asked this woman who was making pladin. I don't know what does it.
I think he was asking.
He was asking, right? But what is the pladin?
Right. He was asked about this like dairy, just
it's a dairy bread thing, but like what is it?
Bread thing. I don't know.
Okay, it was just whatever. Okay, so it was making that, and that it in an oven, Sorry, I just lost my place. Okay, so making this dairy bread thing in an oven that was then on the ground. Right,
I think
the
bread is on the ground without a vessel.
Right,
then she took a meat pot, and that was hot, and then put it on that same place. Ve'eshavti she'ein kan isur, and I said there's no problem with this. The charasi shel tanur shebala min hachalav lo garami k'deira mishalavim b'tocho chalav v'na'agu b'k'deira shel basar de'ein sham isur. So basically, it says no worse than if it were just two pots. כמו שכתב פוסקים בשתי קדירה שנהגות זו בזו, ורמה מביא סימן צדי ב' וכאן שהחמיר במחבת, היינו להתחילה דווקא. Right. So this thing about the machavat is only lahatchila, but obviously this is a b'diavad situation, and it's no worse than if it were just a milchik pot and a fleshik pot, as opposed to the milchik thing directly.
Exactly, right? He's like, in this case, yeah, even if the bottom of the tanur like absorbed some of the cheesy essence, right? Now, again, the assumption is it's been cleaned off. There isn't any mama shoot left. So it's just like the hot meat pot being placed on the part of the tanur that absorbed some cheesy essence, right? And that's just two hot pots touching. So there, it's fine. Okay. So finishing up these last couple of sifim. Yavni, can you read bet in the Shulchan Aruch?
Sure. תנור שטחו בעלייה אין אופין בו פת עד שיסיקנו מבפנים עד שיתלבן, ואפילו אם הוא של בוכיה, פירוש כלי חרס שמסיקין תחתיו ואופין עליו עוגות. אין לו היתרה על ידי הסק מבחוץ. So this was what we I should have translated. It's what we saw in the tool, basically.
Yeah, this is pretty much the same thing. And now let's look at Gimel.
פת שאפה עם הצלי ודגים שצלען בתנור אחד עם הבשר, אסור לאוכלם בחלב, והני מילי בתנור קטן, אבל בתנור גדול המחזיק 12 עשרונים ופיו פתוח מותר, ואם הצלי מכוסה, וכן פשטידה שמכוסה הנקב שבו, שמכוסה הנקב שבו, מותר, אפילו בתנור צר. So bread that was baked with roasting meat and fish that was roasted in the same oven with meat. You can't eat them with dairy, and these that's for a small oven, but for a big oven that has 12 esronim and has an opening, then it's permitted. And if the roasting meat is covered, similarly a pashtida that it's like opening is covered like with the dough, I guess, it's permitted even in a small oven.
Right, because we think that's like the shtik derot, right? Something that prevents the smell from percolating fully, even when it's in a small space. Okay, and then the last thing the Shaf points out, like something that you might think is an inconsistency in the Mechaber's ruling, right? Which is that in general he rules like the Rif, right? Which is that l'chatchila you can't create a scenario of reichel milta, but b'diavad reichel av miltahi. And so, like again, if you cooked the shchuta and oven with the nevela, you could eat the shchuta. So the question is like, why in this case? The pot she'afa, right? This is saying that even b'diavad, you can't eat that pot with milk, right? And the answer is that similar to what we saw in the Rif, right? That like since you can l'chachila eat this pot with meat, then like, yeah, we're not going to permit you to eat it even b'diavad with dairy, right? As opposed to the other things where if we didn't permit it b'diavad, you just couldn't eat it at all. Here we're saying, okay, yeah, even b'diavad, don't eat it with dairy, just eat it with meat because that's totally fine. Which makes sense. All right. Shkayach, everyone.
Shkach.
Lexie, thank you.
Thank you.
What Siman are we doing this?
Study Daled.